Today's colloquium is entitled Storytelling and the Meaningful Life. My colleagues, Professor Shelburne, Havird, and Haynes, will be relating a few stories today of graduates of Centenary who have used their liberal arts training to construct personally meaningful and professionally successful lives. Why are we doing this? Well, because we believe that one of the hardest challenges that you, our students, face is answering the question, how do I go from being a student, from hanging out, parties on Friday night, etc., to, in a few years, being a success, personally and professionally, out in the real world. One of the keys to this success, we believe in the English department, is to understand the centrality of stories and storytelling for a meaningful life. But what do we mean by a meaningful life? Every one of us is going to have a slightly different answer to that. For me personally, I think back to a movie that I saw as a high school junior that made a deep impression on me. That was the 1969 musical version of Goodbye, Mr. Chips, the story of an intensely strict and overtly cold English public school teacher who fell in love and whose heart was softened, but tragically soon thereafter lost that love. What he didn't lose, however, was his commitment to what President Holloman and Provost Ward often talk about, a sense of vocation, a sense of his life, in this case, being defined, having meaning through his work as a teacher, touching his students' lives. The lyrics from one of the songs in the movie capture an important aspect of my definition of a meaningful life. Quote, "In the evening of my life, I shall look to the sunset, at a moment in my life when the night is due. And the question I shall ask, only I can answer. Was I brave and strong and true?" These lyrics, though somewhat schmaltzy, do raise existential questions that I think almost all of us wrestle with. Exactly who am I and what is my purpose? And what is it that I need to be brave and strong and true about? A liberal arts education, a centenary education, asks you to think hard about what you believe and what you might do in the world. For those of you in Trek 115, it's not called Credo for nothing. It challenges you to define yourself in your own personal mission statement in the world. And how do you do that? One crucial way is to understand your own story, where you have come from, where you are now, and where you might go. And just as importantly is learning how to articulate that story, not only to yourself, so that you understand it, but to others, to persuade them to take you seriously. Your parents, your teachers, a potential employer out in the world. Ultimately, you want them to do business with you. With these storytelling skills, you'll go out into the world and not just be a good worker, but ultimately what we try to train you to be here at Centenary, a good leader. One who can make a difference in the world, one who can be brave and strong and true in making the world a better place. But now let's turn to some of these very concrete stories that my colleagues have to tell you, and Dr. Shelburne will be going first.
I'm going to take my jacket off, though. It has the requisite professorial wrinkles and all those things I'm careful about. We can skip that. Yeah. I want to tell the story of two of our graduates from the 1990s. And I'm going to cast these in parallel with the purpose of illuminating both differences and similarities. Both are graduates, as I said, from the 1990s. Rain Martin in 1995, John Hyde in 1997. Both are Louisianians. That's not surprising with our constituency. Rain comes from Jamestown, a tiny little town in Bienville Parish. John from New Orleans. John's parents were lawyers. He had a comfortable middle-class upbringing. Rain grew up sleeping on the floor of a trailer. For Rain, attending Centenary was the fulfillment of a long aspiration. She was thinking about this since middle school, at least. For John, frankly, it was just the next step. I mean, his kids from his family were going to go to college, and he came to Centenary because it was a college that looked good to him. Rain was a raw student. full of potential but underprepared. John was a whiz kid. In his first semester, it may have been his first year here, I granted him a waiver of prerequisites so he could take my Shakespeare class as a freshman. He had the highest grade in the class by a substantial margin. Rain studied English and sociology, and she taught herself how to study by making posters of important material that she carried with her everywhere, including the calf. So hers was a very public education in that she shared it with everyone else. If you wanted to know what she was doing in a chemistry class, you came to lunch and looked at her poster. John was quieter. He studied English and chemistry, and the faculty even considered changing some rules so that he could more easily graduate with dual degrees. We wouldn't make the change. The differences were more substantial then. But he persevered and graduated with 2 degrees, not just double major, but 2 degrees, a BA and a BS. John headed straight to medical school. Rain wanted to teach for America, a program of young graduates of schools, mostly in the Northeast at that time, that enabled them to teach in the inner cities. But we had to tell her, frankly, that she wasn't yet prepared for that. I think even then, though, it was clear to us that she would be prepared. She just wasn't yet. John says that, and I'm quoting, "The joy of medical school acceptance was tempered with the harsh reality of needing to pay for it." So he joined the Navy, and right after med school was sent to San Diego for his internship, then to Okinawa, then twice deployed to Iraq, where he was the medical officer on Marine helicopters who rescued injured soldiers in the area of Fallujah. He was based in, his unit was based in San Diego, which he loved. Rain, too, made her way to California, but Northern California, where she soon became involved in politics, campaigned for a county supervisor, who won after she became his campaign manager, and then she became chief of staff. 2 years later, we find her in Chicago as director of relocation and support services for the Chicago Housing Authority. She was there for 6 years in her own kind of political, sometimes literal war zone. Her job was to relocate people from Cabrini Green, a notoriously dangerous housing project that was being closed. She's back in Louisiana after that, as chief of staff at the Recovery School District in New Orleans post-Katrina, having followed the director of the Housing Authority in Chicago down to New Orleans. So she's chief of staff in there for the Louisiana Education Recovery School District, and then becomes the chief of innovation at the Louisiana Department of Education and lead author of the Louisiana Education Reform Plan, which became a national model for educational reform. Since then, she founded Stand for Children, an educational advocacy group, and now she's an executive coach, which means, as far as I can tell, that she's taking a well-deserved breather. Meanwhile, John completed his residency in ophthalmology, then a subspecialty in retinal surgery, both in Memphis, moved for quite some time to Charleston, South Carolina, and not too very long ago moved to Ashland, Oregon, with his wife and a 4.5-year-old daughter. The question then, it seems to me, is what do these two people have in common? In some ways, they have led quite different lives, though in crucial ways, parallel lives. First, I want to emphasize that they remain writers and teachers, despite their apparent occupations. John says that a hard-earned proficiency in English gives you confidence to teach, even in unexpected venues. While deployed in Okinawa, I took part in an outreach program providing weekly English classes to Okinawan residents. The friendships made because of those classes are my warmest memories from that period in my life. As a junior officer, I also found myself teaching people at various professional levels, including first aid programs for Marines, more technical training for my enlisted medics, and advising school leadership on medical ramifications of certain courses of actions. In medical practice, I've long since stopped counting the presentations I've given to colleagues either at conferences or in less formal continuing education settings. Not to belabor the point, but I educate patients every day about their conditions and treatment plans. The process of practicing critical thinking as part of my degree coursework undoubtedly made me better prepared for these interactions. Part of what strikes me there is that it sounds like I've given John a set of prompts, key words to hit. I didn't even ask him to write such a thing. He just sent this to me after a brief conversation. For her part, Rain is among the state's foremost advocates for the education of children, which role she still speaks and writes regularly. Among my favorite pieces is her semi-autobiographical article, Every Child Deserves the Best Teacher. She concludes that article this way. I ask that each of you pause for a moment, close your eyes, and remember the best teacher you ever had. The one who really made a difference in your life, whose influence helped you to get where you are today. Also, then, take a minute to think of the teacher who did not believe in you, who did not challenge you and did not increase your knowledge. We all have examples of each. Now open your eyes and ask yourself, which one of these teachers would I want teaching the youngest citizens of Louisiana? I think we all know the answer. Neither Rain nor John has what's sometimes thought to be a typical English career. They're not English teachers, they're not English professors. I got it, Jeff. Their majors did not dictate or predict their careers, but they prepared them for those careers. In many ways, they're not extraordinary people. Instead, they are people who made extraordinary use of their education and opportunities, which is our hope for all Centenary graduates. Thank you.
I don't have anything that well organized. I'm going to talk about a couple of Centenary alums who have, I guess in a way, followed more predictable careers. The first one is Steve Waddell, who finished here in the early 90s, mid-90s, I guess. He's now a newspaper executive and novelist. His plan when he was at Centenary was to teach at a nice, quiet college somewhere and write poems. After the BA from Centenary, he got the MA from Pitt State University in Kansas, where he wrote a thesis on the playwright Tom Stoppard. Then he went to LSU for the MFA, that's the Master of Fine Arts degree, where his principal mentor was the poet Dave Smith. Then he moved to Virginia because his wife's family lives in Virginia. And after they moved there, both of them, for a while, taught at a local community college. That's not much of a way to make a living. No offense. I did it for a while. How did he become a newspaperman? He writes, I ended up filling in on a temporary basis as ad compositor at a local weekly paper. While there, I wrote sports and politics and found I enjoyed that. I moved to another paper when they offered me the editor position and did that for a decade while working on fiction. So he's moved, you see, from poetry writing to fiction writing. New people bought the paper and transferred me to a paper in the Charlottesville area where I became the publisher of the newspaper. A few years later, my boss retired and I took his job as vice president for the Virginia papers in the company. There's a lot of fairly small local papers. And Waddell is the vice president for the Virginia branch of a big newspaper company. Along the way, he adds, I started a fiction magazine called Needle, a magazine of noir, that's, dark crime fiction, and a fiction website called DoSomeDamage.com, which is about crime fiction. That's Steve's forte. For the 5 years that we had Needle magazine, we always had stories placed in the Best American Mystery Stories, an annual anthology from Houghton Mifflin. Steve is really quite a remarkable fellow. He gets up about 4:30 every morning and writes before he goes to work, and gets the kids ready for school. He and his wife obviously share those responsibilities, but that's what he does in the early morning hours. And several years ago, he published a novel of short stories, or a novel as a series of short stories called Country Hardball. It came out from Tyrus Books, which is now a Simon & Schuster company. Simon & Schuster bought the company and then changed the name of it. So the novel, if you go online to purchase it now, it's with the Simon & Schuster imprint. This novel was reviewed in the New York Times Book Review. It's also been translated into French, where it was reviewed in the French Rolling Stone. So Waddell's done quite nice. He also, I think about how storytelling contributes to the meaningful life. Well, Waddell was asked, actually commissioned, to write a story that's a follow-up on this novel, and it was published in Playboy magazine. I think it was the last nudie issue of the magazine, for which he was paid $7,000. So, nice. How does, his English degree obviously factors in on his work. He says, I spend a good deal of time, even as a newspaper executive, teaching storytelling to reporters. Anyway, I tell the story because, sometimes students say, well, what can I do with an English degree? Well, journalism is an obvious thing to do, but you don't always know, when you set out how you're going to end up becoming a journalist. Waddell didn't have that in mind. The other student I'm going to tell a little bit about is, is Libby Bloxom. I just finished reading a set of short compositions in the Trek course about students' aspirations, and I noticed that several of the students want to be lawyers. What do you think they're majoring in? Political science. For now, anyway. English is a great major if you're going to go into law. Libby Bloxom is now an attorney in Washington, D.C. She grew up in a small town of some 2,600 people called Hooks, Texas, which is outside of Texarkana. Her parents were civilian employees at the nearby Army base. She attended public schools. She graduated high school with kids she had started in kindergarten with. It was hardly, by her own admission, the most academic of environments. However, her mother had served in the Peace Corps in the 1970s in Tunisia, and her father had been in the Navy on a submarine off the coast of Japan. So Libby grew up with the idea that to travel was a really romantic thing to do. She planned all along, actually, to join the Peace Corps, though the thought of doing so terrified her, she says. Law school, however, was not on her mind. Even so, joining the Peace Corps, which took her to Swaziland, was, though it had terrified her to begin with, it was, she says, the best decision I ever made. Her 2 years in Swaziland, that's in Africa, fostered a self-confidence I needed, particularly now in my career as an attorney, and I discovered a self-reliance and resilience I did not know I had. If you want to know what all she did in the Peace Corps in Swaziland, I can tell you during the Q&A or afterward. One of the things that she did in the Peace Corps was to meet, and this is serendipitous, of course, was to meet her now husband. He was then a med student from New Zealand who was studying with an ophthalmologist, an eye surgeon, at the hospital in the town where Libby was in Swaziland. Anyway, she felt lost when she returned home from Swaziland. She wanted, she says, to get back into an academic setting. She had toyed with the idea of going to law school, so she decided to take the LSAT, and she told herself, if I get into a good law school, I'll go, which she did. Her criteria for law school were geographic area. She wanted to be in a city that was walkable. She wanted to be somewhere on the East Coast. She also wanted to go to a large school. She wanted to be in a big program with a high academic reputation. Her first choice was Georgetown Law in the D.C. area. And she got in, and she has since, of course, graduated. What was the impact of the English major? Here are two examples. Her words. I was already conditioned to the amount of reading and writing we had to do in law school just because we had to do a lot of reading and writing as an English major at Centenary. Our writing at Centenary was scrutinized by both professors and classmates alike, and coupled with the amount of reading we did, it was impossible to leave Centenary as an English major without having some semi-decent writing skills. Also, as English majors, we were always encouraged to think analytically about literature and even life. This is all you do in law school and as an attorney. You read a lot, you write a lot, and you analyze everything. Reading regulations written by bureaucrats or convoluted cases and finding some meaning in them is no easy task. But after having to interpret and break down T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, it's a piece of cake. She adds, I think an English background is almost essential to succeeding in law school and being a good attorney, and I had a good education from Centenary. Libby is now an international trade associate at Holland and Knight, a large law firm in Washington, D.C. She says, I'm a regulatory attorney, which essentially means that I have to stay on top of whatever tweet in the middle of the night changes our trade policy. So anyway, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you.
So is it my understanding that the microphone is the microphone on? It does not appear to be on. Well, then I can't play you anything, so I won't. So I would also like to talk about a former student and alum, A.J. Haynes. If you don't know who she is the front woman for the band The Serotones. She was recently flown to New York for a photo shoot by British Vogue. She's been featured in Rolling Stone, The Wall Street Journal, the New York Times music and fashion sections. And what I want to talk about is the way that AJ lives a piece of advice that I always give my students, which is that as you are figuring out who you are and what you want to do, think about how to combine your passions with your talents. It's no good if you have a passion for something but no talent for it. Jessica Hawkins talks about her very short career as a French horn player. She had the passion but not the talent. But also you may have a talent for something that does not bring you joy. And so that's not a good path either. So you have to figure out, and sometimes creatively, maybe your passion is music, but you don't have the voice of A.J. Haynes. That doesn't mean you can't be a writer and review music, or a blogger about music, or find some other path. You could become a sound engineer, right? But that's what she does. She combines her passions with her talent. And her passions are not just music. I think if you asked her, she would tell you that her passions are poetry, travel, theory. She's always reading and rereading theory that she started to learn as an English major at Centenary, activism, and women's health. These are important issues for her. And so if you listen to her music, if you see her perform, you'll hear her talk about women's health issues in her music. You'll hear her engaging these important cultural questions. I don't know if I'm supposed to tell you this, but there are 2 incredible songs on her new album. One is called Power, and one is called Fear. They go together. They are about threats to women's health and women's health rights. And they are about the Black Lives Matter music. So it's not that her activism is over here and her music is over here. These things inform each other. So some of the characteristics that AJ demonstrates that I think go right back to our mission as a college and our mission as an English department, she is absolutely a lifelong learner. She continues to be a voracious reader. Just the other day we were having dinner and she was talking about yoga. She's really into doing the yoga. And she's like, well, then I looked up the history of yoga, and holy shit, right? There's this whole complicated patriarchal history to yoga, a complicated post-colonial history there that nobody really thinks about. And I said, well, it seems to me that Edward Said's book, Orientalism, would be a first step in really understanding and thinking your way through this question. And she said, you're right, went out, got Said's Orientalism, and started reading it. That's a curiosity that is what is keeping her creative, right? It's what generates the songs that she writes. But it's not just that. There are some technical abilities that she learned as an English major. She has a deep familiarity with things like genre, structure, form, allusion, meter, rhythm. In her music, you will hear allusions and references to Audre Lorde, Lucille Clifton, Langston Hughes. Off the top of her head in the middle of a show, she'll start reciting, I couldn't do this, whole passages from Hunter S. Thompson. Her songs make references to gospel music, traditional hymns, biblical stories. And so I think these things all make her the sort of dynamic artist that she is. But also I cheated on this assignment, and I sent her a text and said, hey, I'm supposed to talk about you, what should I say? And so she texted me back a couple minutes later, and here's what she said. She said, well, I would talk about how American music, one of our few and more meaningful exports, I think the others are booze and tobacco, has had a global impact. I would draw parallels with that and Centenary's mission to make students citizens of the world. I've gotten the opportunity to share my songs with people all over the world. We have fans everywhere from Mexico City to Japan. I would also say that to make a song compelling, much like any essay or any type of writing, you have to commit to a moment and fine-tune your craft. I work my ass off to write good songs. It's not always as easy as people think. I'm borrowing from a living musical lexicon and an oral tradition while telling my story and the stories I've inherited. I've learned as much from Dick Hebdige and Audre Lorde as I have from Sam Cooke and Aretha Franklin. And I will conclude with this. Do I have time for one more point? It's really, really cool that AJ is this successful rock star, but that's not all she is. She's running a business. She is running a corporation. She is basically the CEO of a business. So she is in charge not just of performing and touring, but writing songs and writing songs that help reflect and build her brand. She is managing others. She is in charge of marketing and public relations, and she does spades and spades and spades of interviews. Nothing bothers her more than a stupid question, but she can always give an intelligent, eloquent, thoughtful answer, even to a stupid question, because she can think on her feet. And so I think it's important to think about all this sort of whole range of skills and abilities. And so we didn't teach her to play the guitar in English, and we didn't teach her to hit the back wall. She learned that in church. But I think that there's a whole range of skills that she developed and certain qualities that have led directly to her success as a musician. And so I want you to think about that. All right, cool. All right.
I'd like to thank my colleagues for these wonderful stories. And let me just say right now before I forget, we all look forward to sharing your stories out there in 10 or 15 years. And we may be having to do that from the nursing home by Skype. Not Dr. Hamming. She's going to be going strong for a while. But seriously, we look forward to your own stories as you move forward. Part of what our goal was here today was to let you know there is life after college. There is what you're doing here today, both in the English department and all your courses. And by the way, we don't think English is the only way to achieve these things, okay? These skills. This is partly, since it's our colloquium, we're going to advertise for ourselves a little bit like Norman Mailer does, but which you may not catch that reference unless you take certain classes. But we do think that what Centenary offers you in this liberal arts setting in a small school like this gives you incredible opportunities to really work on and practice the skills that these alumni have who've been very, very successful. You too can follow in that path. It's not guaranteed. They all worked very, very hard to get where they are. But they did take advantage of what was offered here. And one of the things they did was to listen to their professors. They listened to other students. They were very intentional about sort of developing themselves. And so we want, really today was to encourage you to do that, to not become too narcissistic and look too inward, but really start thinking about your own story and where you're from, where you are now, and maybe where you're going. So let's open it up for any questions, and then we will be out of here so that you can get to your next class and learn the skills that they're going to teach you in that class. So any questions or any comments, suggestions?
I don't have a question, but I have a comment, and it's that the thing that was striking to me about all these stories is that these were not narrowly focused people. They may have started majoring in X, but they were expanding they were opening their lens throughout their time at Centenary, and then using everything that showed up in their field of vision to craft a very sort of customized approach to how they were living their lives. I was just reading today an acquaintance of mine, Dr. Rita Sharon, started out a medical doctor. She went to medical school, she became a medical doctor, and she did that for many years, and in her 50s, I think, or maybe late 40s, decided that really she wanted to go back and sort of reverse engineer and pull back her passion for English. So she went on to get a PhD in English in her 50s, and she is the founder of the narrative medicine program at Columbia University. So she's created a whole field by taking these two very seemingly disparate sorts of fields and knitting them together in ways that make eminent sense if you've ever been to the doctor and had someone with good bedside manner as opposed to someone without one.
Thank you, Provost Ward. You're basically articulating what in my Trek class we read yesterday, John Henry Newman's The Idea of the University, where Newman talks about the balance of all the different disciplines in the university, how they're all important. Again, he doesn't believe in what would later be known as a kind of two cultures debate, the clash between science and the humanities, for example. For Newman, all disciplines contribute to each other. They comment on each other. They interact with each other. And to be good at all of those really makes you really good if you can pull that off, right? And so I think here at Centenary, the liberal arts approach to education believes in that. We as a college believe in that. And we think that kind of story can lead to success. Need a little bit of luck, but again, to some degree, we create our own luck by the decisions we make. Other points? Don't want to keep people too long. Yes, Ross.
As I listen to the stories of each of these people that we're talking about, I was struck by, because you were saying you got to kind of focus on what's good for you and branch out, and then you said, but it's not all about being narcissistic. And I was struck by each of these stories how there was a strong component of service to others.
Absolutely.
I'd be very interested in hearing more stories about the young lady's experience in the Peace Corps, and these sorts of things. And AJ, being passionate about issues and helping the world around them. That seems to be a really strong component of what these successful people do.
Yeah, I didn't bring it up with the case of Waddell, but he is a very active volunteer in his community. I mean, it's like back. Well, we still have service learning. Do we call it that?
The community.
Yeah, and I mean, it's really as if, you know, all those people that I'm in touch with a lot of, you know, former students, and it's really as if it's very gratifying to see these different components of what we used to call the Centenary plan. Now we call it track. To see them, you know, coming together, and I don't mean just in the working lives, the occupations of these former students, but in their whole lives. It's very gratifying.
I think it's partly the redirection of that personal passion too. I'm thinking of Rain, who in middle school led a little revolt in her K through 12 school of 200 people against worksheets. She said worksheets are not teaching, and she shut down the school briefly. But this passion, which at that point I think was really about her, became the passion that she spent the rest of her life so far fulfilling, I think, which has to do with access of education and appropriate education for all students, but especially those in Louisiana.
Well, it's also the discovery that some people will listen to you if you have something to say.
Right. Well, you have to listen to Rain. It's Rain.
Yeah, well, but also if you develop certain skills,
yeah, true.
You know, no one will listen to you if you have nothing to say, or you can't say it in a persuasive or interesting way. But also, what's the point of having people listen to you if you have nothing to say, right? So it's that connection between your own motivation and your own skills and what the world needs.
I'm struck. I was rereading some of her stuff recently, and I looked at her senior seminar thesis, which we happen to have a bound copy of for reasons I don't altogether know, from 1995, and it's a decent sort of workmanlike product, but it's not great writing at all. And her, as she has become a more impassioned advocate, she has become a much better writer as well. But she's found really it's a sort of calling, I think.
I would say, you know, it's a lot of you, feel a little bit uneasy, you know, about what you're going to do, and you think you've got an idea maybe now, you sort of know what you want to do, but you don't really, because there's so many jobs out there whose names you don't know, right? So if you don't know their names, you probably don't know they really exist.
And which may not even exist yet.
Yeah, and you know, I think that one of the themes, at least in the case of the two people that I've talked about, is that the kind of education that you have will prepare you to take advantage of certain opportunities that come your way. They may not even look like opportunities when they come your way, but the kind of education that you'll have had will allow you to move in directions that are difficult really to anticipate. I mean, you just don't know. I don't think Waddell, for example, never thought he was going to be a newspaper, and that was not what he set out to do. You know, but he needed some money, so he was composing ads, and one thing led to another, you know. And he happened to have the skills. Waddell was a good writer as well as, he's also a good talker as well as a good writer. And he's well organized, and he was able really to get not only into the writing side of things, but get into the executive side of newspaper work. And all the while pursuing this passion that he had developed along the way for a certain kind of fiction. Wanted to write poems, and I remember him in creative writing poems sort of like Frank O'Hara. Well, that doesn't mean anything. But and some of the Kenneth Coke he was just nuts about. But at some point along the way, he decided he would write crime fiction. And there you go. So you never really know quite. I think it's you have a sort of sense of your narrative, your story, but the kind of education that you would have not only gives you the opportunity to take advantage of what comes your way, but also to embrace the idea of not necessarily knowing where that narrative is leading.
It's like a good story that you don't know the ending of, but you're, but you stay with it because you want to know.
You can relish, really relish the uncertainty.
Okay, we've got to shut down and let you get to your 1 o'clock. Thank you all for coming. We'll announce next month's speaker here. We're in negotiation with him and hopefully find out in the next few days and let you know. Thank you to my colleagues, Dr. Shelburne, Dr. Havird, Dr. Hamming. Thank you all for coming.